Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Savory Stories segment of the Good Food Summit. We're really grateful that you made it out here. We know it's later in the day and things are getting cozy. So we're going to be sharing with you today a really beautiful video that was collected from the stories of 6 different people in our community. But before we jump into it, I'll introduce myself. My name is Jemana Rishek. I served as the creative director on this segment of the Good Food Summit. And who am I? That's a pretty big question. I personally came to Canada about 3 or 6 years ago now to study herbal medicine, but my roots are originally as a second-generation Palestinian refugee and as a Jordanian woman here on these lands. And I work as a herbalist in this world and as a community organizer and connector, and with the local Palenke food sovereignty initiative as well. I'm really excited to have you all here and to speak a little bit more about some of the things that really make my heart beat about the food movement. And over here on my right, we've got my partner in this panel discussion, Asiyah Robinson.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. Hi, my name is Asiyah Robinson. Who am I? I do not like answering this question, but I was born and raised in Freeport, Grand Bahama, and so my roots are very connected to the earth, and I was very grateful to be asked by Jemana to even be here on this panel, but also to be partaking and sharing my story with you in the film that you're going to see. And so you'll hear a lot about me in there, so I don't feel like I need to touch on that, but I think this process has been so beautiful because we've learned so much about different people's stories, about how interwoven land is to people's histories, their families, their connectivities, their awareness, their education, their everything. And I look forward to my connection and building that. And I think this is just one of those processes that helps with that. And I'd also like to take the time to acknowledge and respect that we're currently holding this space on the territories of the Qwustenuxun-speaking peoples, also known as the Songhees and Esquimalt peoples. And when we're talking about land, when we're talking about food, there's no way you can't acknowledge and understand the importance of sovereignty on lands without local indigenous peoples. And so I'm grateful for those who held space with us and shared stories, and also for them allowing us to be here in this space today. So thank you.
Yeah, and before we jump into the movie, I would love to share a quote that's been one of the guiding principles of the way we've moved through this process. This is a quote by Daniel Wall, an incredible figure within the regenerative food movement and land management movement. And it goes, "Answers are a means towards better questions, and this is what it means to think in a regenerative capacity." So our approach with this video and with this entire segment today is to really engage the process of curiosity and using our questions as a way of understanding our solutions and vice versa. Mm-hmm. So buckle in, get some food because this is going to get you hungry, and enjoy the film. Da, 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 da.
When we talk about Santiago de Cuba, which is my hometown, food is everything. If you go to a party, there is food. Everywhere you go in our city, food as a means to connect people, to connect stories, to connect places. My name is Ariel Reyes Antuan. I'm originally from the eastern part of Cuba, Santiago de Cuba, and I mix heritage with Haitian, Congolese, French, a bit of everything, but I didn't identify myself as an Afro-Cuban. I'm part of one of the founders of Creative. We have been focusing in food sovereignty initiative and trying to decolonize the way we engage to each other, the way we create and co-create.
My name is Jess, and I have mixed heritage, Australian, Prussian, Indigenous, French, Canadian, of many things. Ariel and I, my spouse, have created the EA Collective, where we're working on food sovereignty initiatives and awareness campaigns of various sorts around connecting to the land. Due to complications when I was younger, I don't have the stomach and gut flora of the average Joe. I definitely have a very involved history with food that's really been the core of my transformation, both physically, emotionally, as a human being.
Fresh food in Cuba, it is hard to access, but at the same time, we have the seasons. We have the mango season, we have the avocado season. You go to your neighbors like a mango tree and you grab the mango. When I moved here, it's like, wow, that connection was broken.
So this really caused a revolution within our household to be cooking everything from scratch, to know where our food comes from, to understand the importance of why we have to eat local. And so it really became an educational platform, talking to people about why it's so important for us to know about our food, not only where it comes from, but the nutritional content when we eat it and we cook it and how that changes and how our body processes food. And so yeah, that honestly became the foundation for EA. It just really naturally transpired.
A lot of what we ate was very much of the land, was very much fresh and just vegetable based, and like catching fish and things like that. That which was of our land and around us and surrounded by us. And my mom always made sure that we had food that was nutritious, food that had vegetables in it, food that tasted good, food that was like literally just of that area. My name is SÄÄNÄÄITEL. When you ask me about who I am, the first thing that comes to mind is my nationality, because I do have a really strong tie to my land. So I was born and raised in the Bahamas, Freeport, Grand Bahama, the most northern island. And both of my parents are also Bahamian. My mother, on my mom's side, her mother is Bahamian and her father is from Britain. And then on my dad's side, as far back as we can trace it, he's Bahamian. So I've like a lot of very strong ties in the Bahamas and a lot of family. I'm Muslim, and I think that's really important to me because it speaks to the way that I walk through life, and especially when we're talking about food, we're talking about people, it speaks to the way that I walk on these lands and the way that I approach things, and that comes also with my relationships with Indigenous peoples that I've met here in terms of the work that I'm doing, and just like the friends that I have. I don't think I belong to any one community. I'm learning more and more about myself and the way that I engage with certain communities and the vibrations, I would say, that I feel with certain people. So like when it comes to Indigenous populations, like I'm Indigenous to the Bahamas, but what really drew me to Indigenous peoples was the ceremony that they hold and just the beauty of that, and being able to sit down with them, being able to share food, being able to just understand the way that they connect to land gave me an opportunity to learn more about that connection to land and gave me an opportunity to genuinely understood what I lost when I left home.
This is our garden here we call ÞοπΕΝΕՆΗΤΕΛ, which translates as the blossoming place. We got that name from our elders that suggested that would be a good name for here. I think whenever anyone comes here, they can feel the tranquility and the peacefulness, and that feeling overtakes them. My English name is Earl Claxton Jr., and my SÄÄNÄÄITEL name is ÞοπΕΝΕՆΗΤΕL, and that name comes from my great-great-grandfather from Malahat across the water here from SÄÄÁUTW. And I come from the village site of SÄÄÁUTW on the Saanich Peninsula. Whenever you hear at the beginning part of a SÄÄNÄÄITEL word, it means the people of. So ÞοπΕΝԵՆΗTEL and Qwustenuxun, that's us. And my dad said, Saanich is not a place. He said, it's us. We're the Saanich. About 30 years ago, I had an aneurysm in my brain, and I was, of course, very weak. I felt I was becoming strong enough to get out and start doing something useful, being part of the community again. I was wondering, what can I do that I'd be able to do that would be good for the community? And just then a notice came to my door. They dropped off a band notice, and in there they were asking for students for the school, the tribal school, for a horticulture course. And here I thought, well, that's something I can do. I can grow big vegetables and be useful to the community, supply the community with vegetables.
Something that Chucks love to do is mushroom picking. So picking mushrooms was something we did as a family. Picking berries. So foraging was part of the culture. It's something you did, and it was like, why wouldn't you do it? My grandfather was like the king mushroom picker. Like, I have photos of him, like mountains of mushrooms in front of him, like on a table, and like the biggest grin, like just like smiling ear to ear. It's just like gold, right? I'm Tom Kral, nature chef. I come from a Czech Republic lineage, Czechoslovakia at that time. My grandparents, they escaped communism and they came to Canada looking for more freedom. I grew up in a family-run business. It was actually a deli called Prague Deli. And yeah, my grandparents first started it in '68. Being immersed with that, and I grew up in the culture of Czechs. There was a lot of like the refugees coming from there, and they were looking for a taste of their homeland and the culture that brings with it. So that was in Toronto, and our family as well have a cottage. I had that nature aspect growing up. Coming to the West Coast, the call of the wild, I just wanted to like tap into nature, like get to know this land. You know, I'm a newcomer here. Like how could I be a better human and, you know, walk the earth and have that relationship with it.
What a brilliant fire.
Siam des Asiyah, Siam des Walmoch, Siam des Walakwa, Enta Walmosne, Qwustenuxun, Siam Qwustenuxun Salchwen, Ni Chito Lalamechen at a Walmoch's Uslins at a Walmoch Slakan, Ohai Tapka, Sila Ash, Jane Qwustenuxun to Wesley, Shetani Asnanemoch. Ni Earl, Outat de Walmoch Sne Williams, Hatapka Siam na Asiyah, Tequam Qwustenuxun to Qwustenuxun I Squall. As you can tell, I am Aboriginal from the Cowichan tribes here on the island. I am the elders' chef. But what does that mean? I make lunch to serve to my aunties and my uncles every day. If I didn't have to make money, I'd work anyway. This is a job that would be a position within a tribe, within a unit of any like human beings. There would be a chef that would prepare food. That would be my job. We take it completely for granted every day that we eat. Where does that food from? And how did it wind up there?
This was before like a landfill, so we took over. Now we have like some like greens, and you can see that still we have our Palenke. The term Palenke, it is about the African enslaved in the Caribbean that they created all these like settlements where they were like taught by the indigenous people of that land.
Palenke really started in the midst of COVID. We were really inspired and doing our own thing, and then we were like, this is a need in the community. And such a need because we realized that all food security and food sovereignty projects in town are unfortunately catered to and by white people. So there's no space for any BIPOC in these initiatives.
We were like, oh, wait a minute. So the issue is bigger than we thought. It was about educating people to understand the land, to understand the different like food that grow in this land. You know, so there are many components within that food sovereignty and even that food security but we need to talk about the systemic barriers that make people food insecure in the first place. You know, one of the biggest barriers is like food access. And then you go that in our community, let's say 80% of our people live in apartments. You know, in an apartment building, then you have the landlord that sometimes they don't allow to people to garden, you know? And it is this very complex like a dynamic that tells you that the intersect between land access, housing, education.
Looking at our relation with food and how in this very like capitalist colonial system that we're in, you really lose that connection with food. Especially the average person is like living in an apartment or in a house and they don't have access to land and things like that. So they might not know what a vegetable looks like. They might not know how it grows. They might not know that relation that's required to process and harvest that food. So it started to become a personal interest and we're like, oh, well, yeah, that's a very valid point. Like, we don't really know either. We just started gardening ourselves and really feeling connected and inspired. Then COVID hit, basically. And then we realized that it's not just a local issue. It's like, yes, it's a local issue, but it's a global issue. Then we were really inspired to take initiative and create an initiative that would really try and not only give people their own sovereignty and really try and give them a better sense of food security, but also have that as kind of like context to really start talking about that connection with the land and people's relation with the land.
It just takes a little like change of perspective on how we see foraging and wild food.
Smoke be a carrier of our prayers.
Just change the mindset, and then more people that are sowing these seeds and urban environments, and then also protecting natural environments like dandelions, cleavers. Like, you see wild foods like going through cities, of like they're popping out through the concrete, but people walk right by it, not even like understand like what it is, right? So even in an urban environment, like we could start like wild food gardens and native plants, and that could be done everywhere, like in your own backyards. Like, instead of growing the lawn, like let the lawn grow, like let the weeds grow, like put some ground covers in there, some pollinating flowers and all that, and like you won't have to water your lawn so much, and you don't need to cut it. It's just like you harvest medicine that way, and like little things like that. Once you start to get like a little microdose of sort of like wild foods, like you just start to like, you know, open up a bit more. Like people just get that seed and, you know, and they starts to grow. That creates that shift that we need to happen.
We looked for 4 things in a plant, and it was a food, a tool, or a medicine, or an indicator. And by indicator, I mean, I'm thinking of the ocean spray. When that blossoms in the springtime, it has a creamy white, beautiful blossom that hangs down. And when that's in full bloom, that's the sign that that's the good time to go and hunt for deer. And when that same bloom turns brown in the summertime, that's the signal that it's time to go out and catch sockeye out of the reef nets. The name ZၤENEˋITEL, it translates as the man that appeared from nowhere, or all of a sudden. Many years ago, over at SÄouT, the ZڨENEˋITEL people came to us and said that they wanted to put in a treatment plant on our reserve. The mayor for Central Saanich told our chief, when we put this treatment plant in here, he said, you're going to be able to put a glass at the end of the pipe and take a drink of water. It'll be so clean, which was a complete lie. It's toxic. The clams have become contaminated. I haven't been able to dig clams near our reserve since about the 1970s.
How do we make sure that we're nourishing ourselves while also nourishing the land? And I feel like the land comes first and the land will nourish you, but you have to take care of it. And the same thing with our water. Like, water is like the pure, it's what we cleanse ourselves with before I pray. And just the idea that there are so many sources of water that are so completely corrupted. It's the same way you think about food. Food, water, land are essential to entire survival, but we treat them all so poorly, and it genuinely breaks my heart. When I think about my relationship as a daughter to this land, it's just like that is my job. It's my role to take care of it. It's not, oh, because we need emissions down, it's because it will take care of me if I take care of it, and it has to be that way. I'm quite literally a daughter in every aspect of my life because the earth is my mother, and like that connection. And when I understand that, I love my mom more than like any other human on this earth, and the way that I take care of her is the way that I should be taking care of the earth.
Food is culture. When we eat, it's the result of a lot of work. It's not just what we eat, it's how it was prepared. It's how it was preserved. It's how it was harvested. It's how you knew how to harvest it, where, and where that information was from, and how that all weaves us all together. Traditional food is also that way too. We had this whole web of food production. You know, let's use smoked salmon as, you know, like an example. You learn how to cook it, which is like one level below the act of eating. But when we have it, it has to have arrived from somewhere. And that's when we learn how to preserve it, how to actually smoke it. That's at the very bottom of everything. It's the elders and their wisdom. I thought everybody knew how to smoke fish. I thought everybody knew how to prepare smoked fish, how to prepare salmon right over top of a fire using only sticks. I thought everybody knew how to roast all their food in the ground. So I grew up, I assumed that everybody received the same education I received. But that wasn't the case. The education that I received was unique.
They would slide the salmon down into here, and then when it got down far enough, they would bind the top, and it would be held out by the sticks. They decided to name the school here Þ�ENEɁITEL because the elders felt that our language was being washed away by the English, much the same way as we got nearly washed away in the Great Flood long ago, and that Þ�ENEɁITEL, the mountain, saved us. We didn't have a written language, so traditionally the elder would be in the longhouse, and the children or interested adults would be around and listen. That was the way that the information was passed on. All things are living, and all things are important, even the tiniest thing. And I think that was brought to everyone's attention this past year with what's known as the pandemic, a tiny thing that you can't even see. It stopped the world. We've come to a halt, and I think it's kind of a wake-up call for everyone to say we need to become better here so that everything is sustainable.
We need to tap into and look at how Indigenous people have done it. And they've tended the plants, they've tended the earth, they supported the plants from growing, right? They cultivated it in a way that, you know, spreading the seeds, pruning plants and all this to produce more food, more wild food. When you're all really in harmony with the land and living with it, this connection just comes up. Like Indigenous communities, like very supernatural, like, and they were just eating food from the land, like they were. But when you start to switch into a conventional diet, you just kind of disconnect that. It's like cutting the umbilical cord. Have tradition, like bring in the ceremony, build a better relationship with the First Nations people, because yeah, there's a lot of healing work to do. So I think one of the steps is first, you know, doing the work on yourself and healing the land, and something that really takes time and could take generations to heal this bridge. When you build community around the gathering and the cooking, when they're fueled up, this light really shines, and that's the light we need in this world.
You know that when you cooking together, you're bonding. You're bonding with your ancestors. You're bonding with the people that came before you, you know? So talking about food, we are talking about community. EJ Creative, it is about talking to people that we are in this together. We are really made up of the stories of our people. That's why for us, food, community, they are interconnected. I always remember my mom making fufu. I also remember my grandma making fufu. It's an ancestral food back in West Africa. That process of like smashing the plantain for me, it is a way of bonding. I remember my mom, okay, Arielito, please help me doing this. And smashing plantain and cutting the garlic and, you know, grounding the pimienta dulce, the sweet pepper or allspice. Fufu makes me feel alive. Fufu makes me be connected to my mom and my grandma, you know, and the people before my mom and my grandma, because someone taught my grandma how to make fufu, and my grandma taught my mom how to make fufu, and my mom taught me how to make fufu, and I'm going to pass that down to my daughter and all the children coming up. You know, fufu makes me happy.
You can't learn on an empty stomach. You don't feel that connection without actually being connected. And that's one of the easiest ways as humans, because food is what literally feeds and fuels you. And when you understand the process, and then the process of even just that cultivation, that aspect is also lost. In order to live in a world that is anti just the mess that we're seeing now, this capitalistic, individualistic, only one person at the top, we have to learn to trust each other, and again, in a way that's not just about what you can give me, but what we can share for each other. I think genuinely the biggest barrier is that people don't recognize there's a barrier. I think the biggest barrier is that people genuinely don't see an importance in having a connection to the land. It doesn't provide the materialistic things that people are striving for so far in these kinds of societies. And so the first step is genuinely just making people aware of what they lost and that connection, why that's important.
I needed to make sure that I could share this information, because there's not a lot of this information out there to be shared, but also that everybody needs to know these things. We're losing it way too fast. I'm literally watching the elders leave this world with information that was never shared. I moved home 12 years ago, and I began working with the elders, and one of the most obvious changes is that almost every day with the elders, maybe every other day, they like to acknowledge the chef. You know, they'll say things like, I know your ancestors, I know you for generations, I know your mom, I know your dad, I know your grandma, I know her parents, all the way back. You're not just a cog in a machine anymore. You're a vital member of the community.
As humans, like, we are like a medium, right, of heaven and earth. Like, we are on this land, on this planet, and food connects us. Finding someone like Dante lived, 10 years out in the bush, just like, living off the land, like, yeah, foraging, camping. But I saw this thing, called Wild Food Fridays, right? I was like, oh, cool, like, I gotta go check it out. So that was Dante that was hosting that event, and he was been doing this kind of like wild crafting, cooking, and all that. I was like, this looks really cool. I really gotta come check it out. Finding a mentor, like finding someone that's like willing to share the knowledge, like that they've, lived through their own experiences, and they're willing to share that. And with the children too, like get the children like into it, get the children like stoked up on it, and then they'll be like all lit up and wanting to partake. I think a lot of focus on children right now, and take them out and, into nature kind of immersion schools, and teach them the names of the trees.
As part of my work, I've been reintroducing the cooking methods back into our communities. The fish on a stick and clams on a stick, and pit cooks, these kind of things, showing them back into the communities. And sometimes I've gone to places and done a pit cook, and the elders have come out and thanked me for preserving that method, and some of them even cried. They were so happy. One of my elders long ago said to me, "You know, Earl, we got to be ready." He said, "One of these days they're going to say to us, well, we tried our best to run things, and they're going to hand it back to us, and we got to be ready." He said, "We got to be ready to show them how it's done proper." That's part of what I've been getting ready for. We stayed here for so long that we have full knowledge of all the plants here, and everything has a use or a purpose. Each of the plants we use for different things. So I feel like it's kind of like a renaissance or a new beginning for us.
I think when we talk about policy change, it needs to go in both ways. Within the Grassroots initiative, we push the system to really show like, okay, there is an issue here and there is lack of representation. When I moved here, I felt the need to share my voice as an immigrant, as a Black person. I'm an Afro-Cuban. I really want to use my intelligence, to use that creativity that people from the African diaspora for centuries we have been using to survive, but I wanted to use it to really empower people, to bring change. For me, the change comes from within, but when you are oppressed, you don't have time to think about that. When people have the time to really feel that abundance that nature provides for everyone, then people can really understand that they are part of the change.
It's a thing, it's not a process, it's not a foundation, it's not anything fundamental. And when you genuinely educate people and you make them aware of how core food is to literally everything, access, policy, legislation, systems, just processes, it's interwoven in everything. And when you realize that is one of the biggest barriers that we have as peoples who are oppressed, whether it's because of sexuality, race, gender, ethnicity, whatever, when you realize that is something that we all share in common, and if you actually were to break that, you would be breaking through so much and you would be able to help all of these systems. That's what I think the leadership needs to do right now, because I think there are a lot of people who are amped. There are a lot of people who have energy. There are a lot of people who are doing things. People very much like to fight for things that are a lot more public and beautiful. Things that just seem, I can Instagram this, I can put this somewhere and it just looks amazing. Me digging in the ground, me planting a seed, it doesn't look revolutionary. No one wants to video that. It's not my fists in the air. It's not a powerful, motivating speech. It's not an actual protest or rally. It's not a blockade. It's like literal growth.
We can't really rely on politicians to make the change. We need to be the change. There must be a better way to serve food to people rather than a commercial kitchen, and like the overall infrastructure and just like the frequency of like exhaust hoods humming and the fridge compressors like buzzing, and then the printer checks and everyone's like scattered and very fast paced, and that's over long term it just starts to diminish your health. I just could feel my candle was like started to dwindle and I needed to do something. Dandelions and the medicinal mushrooms, it's all like, that is the real superfood for me.
Aboriginal food and food production is basically outlawed, and a lot of traditional practices were actually outlawed for a long time. We need, our world needs to acknowledge that the Canadian world is just a visitor here in our world, the Aboriginal world, which has lived here for thousands of years, and that we would like to supply to the world with our foods. What I would like to see, a true decolonized food system would allow the tribes to design their own food systems and to produce and sell their own traditional food products wherever they see fit. And then ask yourself, if all our traditional foods, Aboriginal foods, were allowed, would our culture be more prevalent in the world? I think the answer is yes.
My dad said that they came and told us they outlawed the reef net because they said it was an unfair way to catch fish. After we were outlawed, he said they allowed the seine fishery to come in and they became rich. We need to really start doing something serious about trying to save the salmon. They're in serious decline right now, and we're seeing less and less salmon every year. If we really want to become serious, is that we need to halt the sport fishery. They're always taking too much, more than they need, which is contrary to the Saanich belief, is that you only take what you need, because if you take more, you'll waste it. We've suffered and continue to suffer. We've been an untapped resource. It's just starting to come around now where people are starting to ask us about, well, what do you know about the plants? What do you know about the moons? What do you know about the stars? What do you know about the winds and the tides? We all need to walk together to heal.
Welcome back. I hope you really enjoyed that experience and you're able to sit with whatever emotions or reflections came up through listening to the stories of all these incredible people. I'd really like to take a second to acknowledge and extend such deep gratitude and appreciation for my partner in this project, Emily Robertson. I've learned volumes from this woman about what it means to listen and how to see the stories as they move through people, not only in their voices, but through the way they move in the world. So thank you, Emily. Hope you're out there watching right now. And I also just wanted to mention as well a big thank you to everybody who shared their stories with us. It was a very sacred process, and so much more was shared than we were able to fit in these 35 minutes. So the whole team here is looking into how we can create more of this content to help share some more of the stories that were given to us as gifts by the people that we had the opportunity to speak to. So now we're going to segue a little bit into a panel discussion. And amongst our panel, we're really excited because we've got Ariel and Jess who are in the video. So they're going to get to speak to some of the quotes and some of the things that were brought up within that space. And unfortunately, we're going to have Earl join us this evening as well, but he's not feeling too well. So he's not going to be with us tonight. And so let's jump in. Today's theme, we're going to be exploring what it's like to come from the angle of exploring with curiosity what kind of concerns are coming up within individuals and their communities, and how our stories and our relationships to food and how it connects us to culture, to land, to our ancestry, and what it means to be human helps to shape the way that we approach policy and change in the world. So I'd like to start out by inviting all of our panelists forward. And we're going to be asking you guys a few questions in terms of introducing yourself rather than speaking out your bio. But we've got a little bit of a theme today. our entire exploration is really going to be based on the principle of what kind of values and loyalties are leading the kind of work that we're doing within the food sovereignty community and the food sovereignty movements that we're a part of. And so to get started, we'd love it if you could take about like 5 to 7 minutes to introduce yourself and to speak to what kind of values lead you in the work that you're doing in the world, but also just as an individual and how you show up into your community. And as well as what is it that you are loyal to and what is it that guides the rhythm of how you show up in the world, both within a professional capacity as well as a personal capacity.
Jess and Ariel, if you guys want to start us off first.
Thanks, Asiyah and Simona, for the beautiful introduction. You guys have set a beautiful stage here for us to all enter in, and created such a beautiful space as well with that video that I think really communicates so much emotion alongside all of our thoughts and feelings on these complex subjects. So thank you for that. I think one of the biggest values off the bat that we really try and prioritize, Ariel and I, with the year, is really looking at community-based initiatives. So looking community first to see what the needs are in the community and how we can then use that ripple effect to look outwards and then try and strategize and plan our projects and initiatives around those needs in the community and not have the standardized top-down approach where we assume we know what the problem is and we're gonna just do what we think is best and execute that plan. We find that's one of the main things that drives our initiative.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think as well that one of the values, and yeah, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you Yumana and all the team behind the video. It was like a really amazing and it really touched my heart. But back to the question, I think it's about living in reciprocity. As Asiyah was explaining, as Earl, Jared, it is about, reclaiming our relationship to the land. So for us at the J Collective, that's what are we trying to share in the community. It's like the need that we need to start like listening actively, and we need to create networks of support between each other, but at the same time, we need to make justice to the earth. So that for me, it is a drive for us, that is part of the ecosystem of the EJ Collective. It is about showing that we are in this together, but showing that we must live in reciprocity to the land and go back to our ancestral practices as much as possible. So I think being pragmatic, I think that those are the principal values for us.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very beautiful, that idea of just living in reciprocity to the land as well as the community around you. And I think that's so important to bring forward. So thank you so much for being here, Jess and Ariel. Tiffany, if you'd also like to take this time to introduce yourself based on what you're led by, what values it is that you hold, and what kind of leads that rhythm for you. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Hi, can you go to Hannah next, please?
Definitely.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah. And I just want to say thanks so much for organizing this event, and thank you for the beautiful film, and thank you for the invitation to join tonight. Just some really inspiring things going on. So thank you for that. I think that for me, a lot of what guides my work is really just a deep love for humans and for plants. And I know that sounds quite simple, but it's really the core of it. And the idea of reciprocity is something that also very much drives me, and trying to find ways to instill that in every step along the way. And then the final thing, I think there's a few things, or two more things I'll say. Social justice is a very strong driver for me. And that can take many forms. And then I think one thing that I really rely on is the idea of curiosity, because with curiosity brings, I think, humility and a place to understand that we're constantly learning, and being curious about different ways and different approaches is I think, a really good way forward, at least for me, in the way that I'm working.
Definitely. Thank you. Yeah. And I can definitely concur with that aspect of curiosity. It's something that I have in spades. And I think people around me probably get tired of all the questions that I have to bring. But I find, and something that Jumena and I were talking about through this process, is that the aspect of learning things is gaining more questions to ask, more important questions, more deep diving questions, and getting to the root of that problem doesn't always mean answering everything, but just developing better questions. So thank you so much for that introduction. Just as a question, do we have Tiffany back? We do? Incredible.
Yeah, I'm back.
Tiffany, thank you so much for joining us. I'd love for you to introduce yourself if you can as well. Hi.
Hey. Zሔር Þ�ENENITEL Qwustenuxun Þvið SḷÁUTW Qwustenuxun No? I can't help you right now. You gotta give me a minute. TA Antu Yathalu Quintal na Nangana Þ祉ENENITEL Istichawaktai yet Nikalos yet Þ祉ENENITEL Good evening, everyone. My name is Tiffany Joseph. My SÄÄNÄÄTEL name is Qwustenuxun. And I am a mother, so what I do will include my child coming in. And I don't consider that, a bother. So that's just going to continue to happen. In any case, I learned recently that the suffix in my SÄÄNÄÄTEL name can be understood to be a person who harvests from the land. So I'm grateful to my teachers, Palenke and SÄÄÁUTW, who gave me that name. I am Þ祉ENENITEL and Qwustenuxun. My mother is Þ祉ENENITEL, my father is Qwustenuxun, and my mother's mother is Qwustenuxun. My ties are to the Underwood family in SÄÄÁUTW and the Joseph family in Squamish Nation, and the Thorne family in Cowichan. And so I have a great loyalty and affinity to the Salish Sea and the Qwustenuxun, known as the Garryoak ecosystem in English, which we recognize as more like the Camas ecosystem or Camas food system, because that is the relationship my ancestors had to this land. Callie, I'm speaking. And our food system are the meadows, the sea, the beaches. They are the forest as well, the wetlands, the mountains, even the places that are rocky are parts of our food system. And all that which I described is where my loyalty lies. I don't know how long I've been talking because my daughter came in and kind of needed my attention. So that's all I'll say for now.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. That was incredible, and I really appreciate you phrasing it in that way in terms of your connection and all that surround us, and how that interweaves essentially into who you are and what it is that you're connected to. So thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I really love what you had to share there, Tiffany, as well, because I think that's a really key piece that kind of communicates through everything that we've heard from all of the different stories, is what does it look like when we realign our loyalty and our values to both what Hannah said, which is our love for people, as well as our love and our connection to land. So it's a beautiful little segue here as well, because Ariel and Jess, you also spoke to the principle that community and things coming out of community is the real I guess, the real meat and potatoes of what it means to be in connection through and to food and to land as well. And so the format that we're going to take today is we're actually going to be picking little bits out of the things that were shared with us through these stories and then engaging them through a lens of curiosity of what these things can kind of flourish into in terms of insights about what we're doing in our food movements and how we can deepen the integrity of connection within these spaces. So to get started, we're going to start for a quote from Earl's interview, where he said to us, "Our history that's passed on orally. We didn't have a written language, so traditionally we would be, well, the elder would be in the longhouse, and the children, or the interested adults, would be around and listen and partake. That was the way that the information was passed on. Certain things like drying the berries or whatever it might be, and it was up to them to hold the stories and to continue them." And then to follow up on that quote, I'll read one from Jared Williams as well. "I needed to make sure that I could share this information because there's not a lot of this information out there to be shared, but also that everybody needs to know these things. We are losing it way too fast. I'm watching the elders leave this world with information that has never been shared." A common theme and reflection that came up in all of our conversations, including the conversations that were happening behind the scenes about all of the memories and experiences these things reflected back to us, was that knowledge of land connection, of land relationship, and food throughout human history has been shared slowly over continued long-term relationships that we have with our elders, with our parents, with our aunties and our uncles, and within a community-like setting. However, in a modern context, many of the youth, both within Indigenous communities and all other communities, are not learning from or listening to the older generations, whether that be because they are too busy or they've got work or we're living in a more isolated COVID and singular family kind of environment now. Understanding this, when we're moving forward in food movements and trying to re-inspire and re-empower our connection and sovereignty to food and land, how do we facilitate these things? See if you want to build on that question.
Yeah, that was beautiful. And I think that into all of the stories that we saw within that video, that family, that connection, Ariel speaking about his mother and then his grandmother teaching him how to make fufu and the fact that he will pass that on. It's that idea of that intergenerational connection and that importance and how that's shared, and not always through a literal lesson, but sometimes that's through watching and that's through learning. And so we're very interested to hear about the experiences from you all. And maybe Tiffany, if we can start also with you. You are a mother, as you stated, so how is it that you're passing on this information to your children, and what does that relationship and that learning look like, and how are you managing that in these changing times, and that might be different from when you were growing up?
Well, I feel inclined to talk about, as you were talking earlier about what is more attractive to people in terms of their activism or community involvement, and what people tend to want to shy away from is, we hear that phrase "stolen land." When I was growing up, there was a plaque in my home and it said BC is stolen land, and it had the year in it, and it was the year I was born. And no nation has ceded their land, except unfortunately those who've signed modern day treaties. And what does that mean? It means that when you go back 6 generations, through every line that I know in my family, that's how far back you have to go to find a non-Indigenous person in my family lines. And how many of those people stole the women in my family? In my language, we call one of our oldest generations ЈΠΕΟΚ. And so this is beyond my ЈΠΕΟK. This is my parents' YPEOK. How might they have been stolen from me, from my parents? Some of them might have been young girls who were chosen by European men to target for marriage, to steal land. But when they targeted those girls, they had promises of loyalty to the land, loyalty to that family, of being in reciprocity. And as soon as their European wives arrived, they created laws so that these men never had to honor that marriage. So they brought in a law that made these people wed, and they brought in another law to disintegrate it. So that's the earliest thefts. It's also the understanding of respecting girls as sovereign beings, as they were treated as objects to be played with and owned and discarded. And that is a legacy that is still thriving in this country. You could go back to my Okwiok, how she was generous and kind to her neighbors and invited people to allow them to graze their cows. And those settlers took that as an opportunity to steal her land. My parents did not speak SÄÄUTW or SÄÄNCHÁFEN or Hulkaminam. That was stolen from me. And my grandfather was stolen from me. I never knew him. He was he would have been one of the people who I could have learned so much about our culture through him. He was an artist and he participated in our winter ceremonies and he just loved it. My father and people who knew his father said he loved being in our big house. And that's where he felt his best. And, even the marriage laws have stolen so much from us. Even in a modern day context, my father and mother divorced because if, it's a necessity in this culture that we live in right now. And when he found a new partner, that's when a big awakening happened for him to be involved with fishing with his partner and learning from her father. And my family has been, broken up because of that. But if we had a different society, maybe my parents could have still been in good relationship with one another, but also moved on to other partners. And it didn't have to be such a huge fracture, a painful fracture. So there's so many ways that, when you try to talk about my relationship to food as a child, there was so much stolen before I could even, eat a fish. I didn't know anything about plants. The only thing I knew about was saskies. And that's the young plant shoots from the berry bushes. And that was one thing I learned as a child, plant related. And it's all a fight. A lot of it is internal. And I've personally fought very hard, and I know many of my relatives have fought very hard to be in a place where we want to embrace our language, our food system, and our culture. But there's so much stolen from us. It's like, who can we reach out to? And there's still that internal healing that needs to go on, and that's why people turn to things like the kind of more attractive ways of being, because you feel so isolated, so you want to find people who have a passion. You're looking for that passion of, we want what we lost to come back to us. And all that being said, I'm very grateful to Earl and his family. They are my family, of course. They've shared what their mother and his grandmother, his mother, shared with our community, shared with a broader community in terms of the native plants. And, because of my broken relationship with food, that's why I focus on being able to plant the foods, plant our food system out, because it feels like there's so much I need to give before I can take, because so much has been taken long before I was ever here. I didn't get to go. I grew up on Qwustenuxun, on the Capilano River, near the Capilano River a lot, and near the Burrard Inlet. I didn't get to go into Burrard Inlet and go crabbing. If you hear stories from my relatives of SḷÁUTW, that's a lot of what they talk about, crabbing and clam digging. So yeah, it's why when I've been asked to be involved in things in regards to food, I'm like, I'd love to give back to this land, so that my children don't have to know that relationship of something being broken like I did. And I'm grateful that my sons get to go to Goldstream every year with their great grandfather. And I don't know if I can take any credit for that, except for bringing them into this world. But I'm really glad that they go there. That's where they feel they're like, can I ask Papa to go fishing instead of going to school? I'm like, yep, that's your true school. That's your true school. And there's more to say about that. And my son's coming to the age where I need to share the significance of that place. But I'll stop there and allow other people to speak. Iska.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, and thank you for opening up and sharing the deeper personal side of that as well. And within your story, I can hear a lot of parallels to shared experiences that are coming up in a lot of the stories we've been listening to, around a disconnection between generations, or knowledge being lost intergenerationally. And what I'm seeing kind of prop up is this question of, if we are creating community movements and community initiatives that are focused on sharing knowledge surrounding land management and connection, how are we fostering that fundamental aspect, which is the part that is the sharing of knowledge over extended periods of time through community? Because a lot of us are living in fragmented homes, right, where we don't have access to grandmothers and grandfathers and watching them work in the kitchen. So our food movements end up becoming the spaces where this exchange can happen. So I'm curious to hear from you, Ariel and Jess, as well as Hannah, briefly, around what your experiences have been around integrating the more community aspect and the oral and story sharing in your food movements, and the way you've worked with land and communities, and what you think might be a good way to bring that into the way that we relate around these things.
Thank you so much for sharing, Tiffany. That was very, very emotional and very, has many flashbacks for me as well. Not that I can relate at all in that context of my lineage, but I've worked a lot in community over the years. I have a background in archaeology and anthropology. So my past has been a lot of working on the land in community. So learning and working directly side by side community, listening to the oral histories as I earn their trust, and listening to the knowledge that they would have about the plants and the language and all of these things. And like Earl touched upon in his quote, that it's such an issue in our current times, this knowledge gap in between generations that is just growing further and further. Because yes, we're living in a society that has different ideals and is not focused on the same things. They don't give the same importance now to knowing about the plants or knowing what time of year is the appropriate time to harvest or anything like that. And so it really does in community create this gap where the youth aren't interested in what the elders have to say. And like was noted, that the elders are passing on and then this knowledge disappears and it creates this huge space where that needs to be filled.
In my opinion, Tiffany, thank you for that. My heart goes to you. And I can relate with that because being the children of African enslaved, it means a lot. Living in the Caribbean, and at least you are here in your land, we have been stolen forever. So, and I think the way to go back is like the place that you call home, like this island. For me, the deepest value is really understand all the living beings in this land. And also, I remember very well, and this can be, for some people, it can be like crazy, but I always say that what our ancestors learned through that interaction and relationship with the land is not lost when we are able to really connect with that realm. For me, I'm a very spiritual person. And even though I didn't grow up in that environment, I was learning, listening. But now when I moved to Victoria, I can see the spirit of my grandma. So from my dad's side. So, and I remember the stories that people tell about my grandma. It's like she was like a spiritual matriarch in her community. She was very well known because she used to help people with plants. But when that curiosity that they came up with me in this land, and I'm able to see like entities that back in my hometown, Santiago, we don't remember. But how's possible that I remember that in this land? You know, and then when I went to research and to ask to my people, this name came to me in this like a practice. They were telling me about Orisaoko. And Orisaoko is the spirit of the land for the Yoruba people. So for me, the way I'm moving into this land and how the way this land and what the spirit of the land is talking to me, for me, I remember because in my DNA, I can remember what my ancestor learned, and in that spiritual practices is coming into me. I'm embodying that practice, and I didn't grow up in that environment, which means that they are looking after us, and we are walking on the shoulders of our ancestors. And as Tiffany said, it is an internal fight. When we are able to come and to connect, we can see them. So for me and for us in our EJ Creative Collective, for me, passing down what I've been learning in this land even though I would like to learn more, I can let my kids and all the children that I've been working with, what I learned, what I know. And as I keep moving forward as a man and as trying to become a good ancestor, I can be passing that knowledge, what I've been learning, what I see, what I listen. So for me, it is a lot of work. It is a lot of suffering, but we must detach ourselves from that suffering, and it is about healing. And I know that it's gonna be long, but our children, they are asking that from us. And it is about a healing relationship. And it is about going back and giving back to the land as much as we can. And I know we are all like light beings. And for me, like, yeah, we have a lot of work. I know that's the weight of the generation. And we are the generation that we are starting the regenerative revolution. So that's my part on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ariel, and I really appreciate that weaving as well of how you've kind of brought light to the spirit and the ancestry. And throughout your interview, I don't know if we were able to really include this in the video. Hopefully we'll be able to include it in future versions of the video, but really speaking to that principle that when we learn to cook certain recipes or certain foods or plant certain things and how they love to be cared for and how to nurture them, we're actually having conversations and connecting and communicating with all of those who came before us and those who came before them that carried this knowledge forward generation after generation. And I think there's this really beautiful thread that's being woven as well of recognizing that to move forward, we both need to acknowledge and be able to sit with and feel through the pain and the loss and the suffering that has happened in our communities, as well as recognize what it is that we are moving towards and focus that energy of sitting with that pain into what we are going to turn it into, how we're going to, so to speak, alchemize it in a new way forward. I just wanted to open up, Hannah, if there's anything that you wanted to share into this part of the conversation as well from your position.
Sure. I'll speak as I'm a first generation settler. My mom is Swedish and my dad is a Hungarian Jew. And so I don't come from an unbroken lineage on land. And so I don't have a history of, I know I do have a history of connection to land through my ancestors. I feel like all humans have connection to land and plants in some way. But I've, been spending time occupying these lands here for quite a while, but, and benefiting off of these lands. And these lands have really helped grow me, if I can put it that way. So they've sort of helped to grow me up, really. And so I have an immense amount of gratitude for that. And I think that if I look at my, my profession or my area of work, in ethnobotany, agrology, permaculture, these fields have, in a lot of ways really furthered the colonial agenda. And that's something to sit with and really examine in my own work. And if I think about my own lineage as well, on my mom's side, the women in my family for a long time were healers, and I learned about plants from my grandmother in northern Sweden when we were living there. And there's a lot of parallel plants here. So I'm not sure what really draws me to this place, and that's still something I ask it. But I do know that I benefit off these lands and that they have helped grow me, and that I feel humbled by that. And I recognize that because of the area that I work in, or the fields that I work in, because of this sort of perpetuation of violence that has happened through these fields, to be honest, I think I feel a particular draw to subvert that and change it. And in terms of sharing, learning with next generations, I feel like that's part of my goal and my intention, through process, not perfection. Still trying to figure that out. But yeah, that's it.
Everyone's been sharing so much about their connection and their groundedness, but things that have really been coming up for me is recognizing the contrast in different stories and how people are connecting and what that brings up when they're answering these questions in terms of your history, in terms of your connectivity, in terms of the way that things have either been removed or the way that you're trying to reclaim and relearn that. And I think through the stories that have been presented, something that has been very core is this idea that what one group, whether it's a minority based on how it's been oppressed, whether it's a fringe community or however it is that people like to call them, there's a lot of communities disenfranchised that are experiencing different things, and sometimes they exist and they result maybe in what looks like the same problem, but the way that they got there is extremely different. So for example, in a lot of the conversation, Ariel, you spoke to the idea that in the African diaspora, when it comes to gardening, when it comes to farming, a lot of things that are brought up is trauma. It's trauma that we're not really sitting with because we've removed ourselves so far from it. But that's trauma because as like you and I, our ancestors were slaves and they worked on plantations. They worked the grounds, and that wasn't a choice. This was your job. You are now doing this because I tell you to. And that was generations and generations tied to a land that most times wasn't even theirs. They got brought from their land to work something else. And not to build a connection and not to grow food to sustain them, but literally to serve a master that was oppressing them. And I think that I can definitely relate in the sense that in this modern day, in this modern context, I think how that presents is when you talk to parents, when you talk to adults within the African diaspora, everybody wants to be removed away from the land. Nobody wants to go back into farming. Nobody wants to talk about cultivating or being stewards of the land because that seems regressive. It seems as though, well, we've worked so hard to remove ourselves from the land, from working the land. Why would we willingly go back? Why would we choose to go and be a part of something that has seemed so lowly? Whereas in contrast, when you think about local Indigenous peoples, they want to be on their land. They want to be there. There is still a connection there. They were forcibly removed and they're fighting to get back. And so while both of us are experiencing such disconnect from the land, and that's affecting our physical, our mentals, our spirituals, the way that we get there is so different. And so one of the questions that we have and what we're wondering, and Juman, I don't know if you want to speak on this a little bit more and unpack, but how do we make sure that we're approaching these aspects of intersectionality, the idea of approaching permaculture, the idea of approaching gardening and being accessible when it comes to all of these identities? Because we know that BIPOC, it's not a homogenous group. It's not monolithic. It's not singular in its the way that it's approached or the way that what we experience. And so how is it that we can honor all these experiences and generally make some sort of inclusive aspect to broaching these areas? And I don't know if you want to speak on that.
Definitely, yeah. And I think that to narrow down this very complex and large reflection that's been coming out of the work is to recognize that when we're having these direct conversations about how we're designing our food systems and how we're engaging our communities and really trying to move on this theme that keeps coming up in our world, it's almost becoming a buzzword, right? This idea of diversity and inclusion is it requires us, when we actually take into consideration the diverse and the unique needs of every individual community, that to create truly equitable futures and truly equitable food systems, we actually need to be addressing the individual needs of each community that act as barriers towards accessing land and food. And then to take that one step further, the barriers which keep us from being able to emotionally and mentally access being involved in food movements. So the direction that this question is going to kind of take is to start off, if you could share with us each individually. I'd really love to hear from you first, Tiffany, about this, and then maybe we can move over to Ariel and Jess and then Hannah. So first of all, what kind of barriers to access? And this can include not only like physical barriers or specifically food barriers, but larger systemic barriers that make it difficult for people to engage in the process. What kind of barriers exist unique to your community? And what kind of needs do these barriers speak to from your community in order to truly approach with an equitable response in food movements?
Some systemic barriers. The beaches are contaminated. The food system of the settler includes a lot of manure. So, there's this manure-based food system. All of that runoff goes into our creeks, which is where our salmon and our trout were supposed to be, laying their eggs and things like that. And then, so that part of our food system is damaged. And then you get to the beaches and all the marine life is then contaminated as well. At this time of the year, like this would be a great time for people to just go down to the beach and clam dig. And many of our relatives are concerned for those that do, because they're like, well, we don't know if that's contaminated or not. So hopefully our relatives aren't digging the day after a big rain or something like that, because that'd be the worst time. And of course there's financial barriers, but I kind of wanted to, what was on my heart to share was that there are many strong leaders in food related work, and they're really creating community around the ways that they garden, the ways that they share food. Sharing food has been a very prominent way of our culture since time immemorial. Literally potlatches in order to give away every material that a family had. And to this day, so many people live that way. They would rather give everything that they had to other people and even to our ancestors before they partake themselves. So that was to answer your question earlier about how are we maintaining through the pandemic, and also for those who are guests in our territory, recognize that there's essentially been a pandemic for us for a couple centuries at least. So we've had this experience of isolation for a long time, but our people adapt, and the leadership stays strong, and the work that we do is to just really support those people who are currently leading. And I look forward to being able to find ways to support them even further as time goes on.
You're one of those leaders too, Tiffany.
Thanks so much for all that, Tiffany. In context of your questions there, Asiyah and Jumana, the barriers really for us came to light when we started our initiative back in the start of COVID there, called Palenke Greens. So for context, we basically started installing these burlap sack gardens in the community, specifically for people of African descent. That was our target group. And through this whole process of learning ourselves to garden and getting people excited about gardening, going to install these gardens and working with them and knowing their histories, we really realized how prominent these barriers are in our community, which we were really not aware of to start off. And so one of the biggest things that kept coming up for our community was land access. The majority of these people where we set up these gardens were living in apartment buildings or basement suites or anything. And even just for us to get them the garden that was technically that we thought was barrier free. We were supplying all the supplies. We came and installed it and taught you how to water it and care for it and all these things. But still, even to be able to install it was an issue. For half the people, they weren't even allowed, they didn't have the authority in their own rental to put a burlap sack on their back porch if it was an apartment, or even if they had a backyard in a basement suite, they weren't allowed because their landlord said so. So understanding that the barriers in these frames are not so minimal, they're actually so vast and so many, it's so multiple. And so combating that was an interesting time for sure, but Ariel can go on about that more.
I always say that there is what Jesse to add of what Jesse was saying, like land is the base of all liberation, of all liberation. You know, so we need to fight for the land, but this is not our land. So we are visitors in this land, so we need to ask for permission. But if we talk about systemic barriers, we have like that structural like a racism. You know, like it creates like a food apartheid. That when I learned about this concept, I was like, oh my gosh. I live like a 500 meters from the thrifty store, and I don't buy there. Why? Income. Even when I live in a very rich neighborhood, I am not rich. So where do I have to go to buy my food? I have to go to the root seller at the discount section. So income, it is like a huge barrier for us in our community. For example, the immigrants and the Black community. Housing. We live in apartments. We don't have access to land. When you go like employment, that is connected to income. So the system and the way the system is being designed is being pushing people away, and it's been creating this violence that we think that we need to work harder to earn that money, but it's not. It's a rat race. We will never get that money. So when you understand that, and I got it like a very fast, because as an engineer, my first job in Canada was cleaning washrooms. So when I understand like, no, because they tell you, you need to go to the ladder, like blah, blah, blah. I was like, wow, this is a game. And that's the dream for each immigrant. It doesn't matter your title, it doesn't matter your degree. You start from the bottom and then you go step by step. And I said, no. You know, so all these like fallacies and all the intersectionality between housing, employment, race, you know, even the philanthropic sector, like a Black-led organizations get like a 59 cents for every $100 that is given to any charity. When I learned that stats, I was like, this is crazy. How is it possible that we are living in a system that keeps oppressing you and keeps practicing violence against our brown and Black bodies? So for me, it is about reparations. We just have to think how that reparation looks like, but we need to start having this conversation. And as Tiffany was explaining, it's about that, how indigenous communities have been removed from their ancestral practices. You know, so you can see that the colonial system has been doing very well their job. But the issue, as I always say, in the spiritual, the fight is over there. Because in the physical, we already know there is a lot of suffering and pain. But for me, it is about making it is about justice. You know, and those economic pressures, like now with that green recovery that the government is trying to put on, like what green are we talking about? And how are we going to keep really like working together? But for me, as a grassroots initiative, for me is to keep pushing and unveiling all this system of oppression and the psychology that that system use against us, which is for me the psychology of oppression. So for me, it is about like, we need to break down those barriers and start like talking and speaking out everywhere we go and trying to explain this to people. Because when I explain this to my friends, they say like, you are exaggerating. It's like, no, it is not like it is there. But the problem, like, we don't have the time to see it because we are thinking that we need to keep working hard to earn the damn money, So I will leave it there.
Thank you so much, Ariel. And I kind of just wanted to build a little bit on that from something that you shared within the video that we didn't get to give too much airtime, but was really, really valuable, which is the merging of that understanding that there needs to be actionable steps that are taken towards lowering these barriers. And also the other side is the showing of a way that is rooted in joy and abundance as well. Asiyah and I were having this conversation right before we came to the summit today around this principle of like, once you've had something that is from the side of wholeness, it's very difficult to return back to that which was lacking. So in this context, that principle being like, once you have grown your own food and seen the freedom of what it feels like to pick something out of the ground and cook something, it's very difficult to return back to a world where you don't understand or see the oppressive nature of not being able to access that anymore. Hannah, I wanted to invite you as well if you had anything that you wanted to add to this conversation before we move on to our next piece.
Well, I'll just speak very briefly and just to position myself, I'm in a very privileged position. I have a huge garden and I do want to say just, I was pretty much echoing what has been said already. I think that, I think I float between a few different communities, but the issue is land. And what comes with that is these barriers are not just, it's like transport to get out to perhaps if you're harvesting somewhere and you need to access more clean foods, as Tiffany was mentioning, or even to access a store where you can afford the food. So transportation, income, education on how to grow, is a big piece, and regulation. And so I think the systemic issue is that we need to think more about food lands around us. And I always think about Cheryl Bryce, because I remember her saying to me once, Hannah, everywhere is a food system, like 10 years ago or something. And it stays with me and I think about it often. And I think that one thing that I just really wanted to say is that, there's so much focus on the individual to remedy these solutions. Whereas I feel like I'm all about, my place is more in the grassroots and that's where we push. But I feel like I'm super frustrated with, the action from governments, because I feel like there's so much weight put on the individual to sort this out. But the lands around us, as Cheryl says, everything is a food system. We just have to let it become that or let it be that. And regulations are not allowing for that. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
No, I really appreciate you saying that, because our last question here is really going to be speaking to directly that, which is what is the nature of the dynamic, the relationship dynamic that exists between grassroots movement leaders as well as with policymakers and government, because this is an area where we're seeing increasing amounts of frustration and distrust, and it's not coming out of nowhere. There's a reason why, and the dynamics that are happening between these kinds of bodies of organization are fostering this. And a large part of of that is also because grassroots leaders and grassroots initiatives are centered from within the community and have a very deep, intimate, and long-term relationship with the communities that they are serving. So therefore, they are much more well-equipped to speak on the actual needs of a community, which will create tangible impact on the things that are affecting those communities. However, what we see happening a lot of the time in this environment, and of course, the nuances of how this happens and how this oppression occurs, again, varies depending on the community that we're speaking about. But as a general theme, we're seeing this general pattern where grassroots movements, leaders, and members of communities will kind of approach our governments and approach our policymakers and say, this is exactly what we need. We're setting it out for you as step 1, step 2, and step 3. And oftentimes policymakers will listen to these concerns and they will be heard. However, they'll be followed by long periods of inaction and at times no action at all. So this is fostering this relationship of distrust, and also what I'm seeing in the youth as well is it's fostering almost like a sense of apathy towards going through the route of policy making and government and the ability to be supported by them. So therefore, there's less engagement from youth around policy change and things like this. So to bring it all back, we're wondering, as grassroots movement leaders, have you encountered this dynamic, and in which ways has it shown up in your communities? And what kind of concerns are you still waiting on action about that you know will create a significant impact on the concerns of your community?
Jess and Ariel, if you guys want to start us off there.
In the morning, I shared that some insights. I can repeat some of them. For me, it's like we need an income security policy, that people can have access to a livable wage, so even including a fresh, affordable food, within the human rights agenda. It is not only talking about food, it is about access to fresh and local. So for me, the other thing is at that micro level, micro local level, we need to be creative, and I know we are. And in finding solution to our own problems, because sometimes we rely too much on the governments and we rely too much on the philanthropic sector to have access to those funds to do things. And for me, because I'm a person I know how to move forward. And for me, it is about making radical decisions that I'm going to do this without money. And I know that when I put the word out there, there are gonna be a lot of people that they're gonna believe in what are we trying to do, and they will support. So that's the other thing, that grassroots, a movement, is not waiting for the government to give the funds or to the philanthropic a sector to allocate those funds. It's let's do it. Let's empower our people, let's empower the youth, and let's talk to our elders to seek for blessings, and let's do the job, because if we keep waiting, the time is passing. And I know, and I feel we don't have a lot of time. So addressing that underlying issues where the government have to start creating a policy change and create a policies for every individual to really enjoy that freedom and to really enjoy that abundance that nature have for each of every one of us. So for me, when we show that we need to put that people, planet, the plants, the animal before profits, and I'm not saying that money is not important as a currency, but it's not the main currency anymore. Collaboration, cooperation, unconditional love, and we need to heal. We need to start that healing process. So for me, those are the important steps that we need to take in order to keep moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ariel. And I'm going to jump really quickly over to another question, just because for the sake of time, and we want to create some space and opportunity for everybody who's watching as well. We forgot to mention this at the beginning. We'll mention it now. Feel free to submit any questions that you have for our panelists as we go through this process, and we'll make a little bit of time at the end here to share some of those questions with our panelists directly. But this next question, really, I would love to hear your response to this, Tiffany, because it has a lot to do with some themes that continue to come up in a lot of our conversations and reflections that were born out of certain requests that we continue to hear from folks who were not Indigenous to this land, but were sharing their process along land connection. So we often see that there is this increasing desire and interest from Þ�ENEɁITEL people to start engaging, be led by, and learn from Indigenous bodies of knowledge. However, this is coming on the back of a relationship that over hundreds of years, really, has been deeply wounded, let's just call it, without going into the details. And so another image of this and how we see this being reflected in the way that people are approaching this in food movements is that there's a sort of tokenization and homogenization of the Indigenous perspective that I hear happening a lot in communities. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes when we refer to Indigenous ways of knowledge or Indigenous land tending or stewarding, we're not really speaking about the fact that there are many, many, many different cultures and tribes within the Indigenous peoples of this land, all of which who have different philosophies, have different functions within their communities, have different bodies of knowledge that they have to share, relate to different plants. And so we see this homogenization happening that in some way strips the holism and also the diversity of our Indigenous communities in and of themselves. So to build on top of that, Earl kind of demonstrated this perfectly when he discussed with us the meaning of the name Þ�ENEɁITEL. And I hope I'm pronouncing this right, but we didn't include this in the documentary because we didn't have enough time, but I will share it with you now, what he shared with us. And he shared with us that for the Wasanic, the name Þ�ENEˋITEL translates into the man that appeared from nowhere, or the people who appeared from nowhere. However, the definition within the Cowichan tribes actually varies quite deeply. And the definition within the Cowichan tribe, it translates to the people we need to feed or support or show the way. So within this, we can see that there's a lot of different approaches, a lot of different cultural frameworks towards the sharing of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous worldviews. And we also have to take a lot of care to not cherry pick the parts of Indigenous culture which are comfortable within our current cultural framework, and to leave out the parts that are less comfortable and make us reflect more on the way that we engage with our communities. So Tiffany, I would really love to hear from you on your feedback, your perspective, and your experience of this theme, and whether this is an issue that for you as an Indigenous woman does come up in the way that people are dealing with it. And then afterwards also, it would be really wonderful if we could hear from you, because Jared shared with us a lot about the very direct barriers that exist for him as a Cowichan elder chef being able to share his culture and therefore his food through his culture due to specific policies that exist that act as barriers. And that is the authority of the Wildlife Act and the Food Premise Regulation. So we're wondering if you could tell us if you agree that these things are barriers that are standing in the way of the sharing of culture through food and medicine, and what other kind of policy change do you believe is required in order to create a presence of Indigenous culture in our food systems?
Yeah, that's definitely a barrier, a policy barrier for our people, for sure. My grandmother's been in the hospital for months, and if she was being fed Indigenous foods right now, I'm sure she'd be a bit better off. My grandfather was a fisherman, and she would have lived off of everything he caught, and my uncles are fishermen, and she spent much of her life living off of things that they caught. And now she's without that. And that policy means she cannot have those foods in the hospital. When I was in the hospital, I did my best to get out as fast as I could. The only time I've been there is when I've had babies. And, you know, when I had a meal provided to me from outside the hospital, my infant was so happy and so well fed. He latched really easily. And then the next meal that I had in the hospital, he wouldn't stop crying because he was like, what happened? You had so much food before that put so much that made me feel full, and now I don't feel full, because I was essentially being starved in a hospital while in the maternity ward. So, and then, yeah, in regards to the cherry picking, the main thing that people love to cherry pick is that we are all one, we are all related. And people use that as a way to defend themselves from being told that, you know, people addressing a need for them to be accountable for their behavior and their actions. Like, how can you tell me something like this when we're all one, we're all related, you know? And it's true, and it'll always be true. That means we have a great responsibility in how we carry ourselves. If you're going to be somebody who's toxic or violent, you're not being a good relative. And in terms of the definition that was acquired from, I don't know where, for Hulkaminum, that sounds like a very nice poetic way of putting that those are people who are always hungry. And we can change that word hungry to consuming, the people who always consume. You could change that again and say the people who always take. There's no reciprocity. So the reason why people establish such terms are because of people's struggle to hear something that is more direct and more blunt. And then again, it allows a person to feel like they don't have to be accountable to Indigenous laws. Indigenous laws of reciprocity. Indigenous laws that, whilst we're all related and we are all one, some of us have rights to do something and others of us don't. Nobody likes to hear that, especially from an Indigenous person. How can an Indigenous person have rights that I don't have? That's the most upsetting thing to me. I'm going to ban your reef net because I don't like you having any kind of rights. I'm going to make it legal for me to end this marriage without going through a formal divorce. I'm going to tell every single non-Indigenous person in this country not to buy from Indigenous people so that you have no economic thriving here. So people can't look at that within themselves and that history and recognize that even how you might be conducting yourself today is an impact from that 7 generations of hatred of Indigenous people, hatred of Indigenous thriving, jealousy, envy. And it's ingrained, and it's something that if we truly want to heal our connection to the land, that, you know, you look at somebody like myself, somebody like my daughter, and recognize that's a person who's supposed to be in charge right now. That's the person that I'm supposed to listen to without question. You look at her and think, her and all her cousins, those are the women that you're going to look to ask for permission. And imagine that and feel that within your heart and in your mind and in your bones and in your blood, and go back to before your tzopiyok and think, what if that person had that belief within themselves? How can I heal that and ripple it back to me so that I know I know how to conduct myself and be in relationship with a person where I'm not objectifying them, where I'm not thinking how I can consume either them or what belongs to them, and treat them as sacred. Because if you saw me as sacred and saw yourself as sacred, not only would you not hurt me, you wouldn't be a violent person. That's what sacredness is. That's all I'll say.
And on that note, the last piece that we kind of wanted to speak to today really does move along that vein. And it's the recognition of a certain degree of entitlement or disrespect in the way that some folks from the Þ�ENENITEL communities approach Indigenous stories, Indigenous knowledge, and the power of Indigenous culture. A quote that Earl gave us at one point was, "Our people still have a fear of the Þ�ENENITEL people stealing from us. And so sometimes we won't tell the stories because we feel the Þ�ENENITEL will take that story and write a book, become famous, or make money from these stories." And I think that part of the framework or this behavior comes from a certain ignorance within certain communities about the depth of sacredness in the story and in the knowledge and the holism of the spirit and the ancestry in these stories as they're shared. So I know that you cannot speak on behalf of all Indigenous peoples, of course, but from your position, can you share with us what sanctity these stories hold for you and how people can approach with respect and honor when requesting to be gifted this knowledge and these stories?
You know, I don't think I've ever had anyone request knowledge to be shared from me, but it's something that again, a lot of people say I share quite frequently. Do you need a bowl? And really it's, is it possible to show up to build relationship with somebody without expecting something from them, especially Indigenous people? I don't know why there has to be an automatic sense that anyone's owed anything. I am incredibly grateful for any knowledge that's been shared with me, and you know, it's a privilege for me to have anything shared with me as a person from this territory, you know. So a lot of people, you know, if I was to describe anything to you and how you should conduct yourselves, it might sound like, wow, that seems like a lot of restrictions. And I would say, yeah, those are the same ones I expect of myself. And so really it comes back to, there is just a need for people to look at themselves. And there's also a need to recognize you've already taken from everyone here. Everyone Indigenous to here, you've taken from them. And so, and like, that's myself too, you know, like, in some respects with some nations and some families. And so if you giving, it's really just finally giving back something that was stolen, is what it comes down to. And recognize that the blueberries and pour it in. Yeah, I was trying to, and then you didn't let me. I did. Recognize that we are highly impacted as Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people by murder, not just violence, but like murder. We are the highest demographic of being murdered. Recognize that our people will often get sick and mysteriously, you know, be lost from this world because somebody was needing the seafood that was meant to be their birthright, and they passed on because they didn't have that food in their diet anymore. Like that's how it literally translates to being lost. today, not just back before my chopmok and okwiok and sopiok. Like, it's happening now. And so it really is, you know, understand who's interested in building a relationship with you, and take the time to understand, like, what can I give? Because you all have much to give, I'm sure. And so share freely. And I would like to say that me as a Þ�ENENITEL person, and me as somebody who's rather visible in this area, there's people who've offered and had no settlers who've had offers and no expectations in return. And I hope that if you are in the area that's now known as Machosen or Souk, or Port Renfrew, which are some of the people we serve, the nations we serve there, I'm not seeing that happen out there. I'm not seeing this willingness to give to the Tsuk relatives, SḷÁUTW relatives, Pachidat relatives. And I'm sure it's going to be a challenge during this pandemic, but there was many people who were willing to come forward and have offers for our community who are living in Qwustenuxun territories. But I can't say the same thing was happening in Tsuk, SḷÁUTW, and Pachidat. And I hope that is something that will happen, because those communities were incredibly excited to be gardening. They were some of the most vibrant gardeners that I was able to meet. And you know, the women, especially in these communities, I mean, a lot of what our communities do, it's just strongly led by women, no matter what area you're in. But you know, what that giving to our community does is help our women understand, like, I'm seen and I'm valued by this society. There's actually people here who are here to come in respect and actually look to me as, in some sense, an authority, because we've been, my grandmother was a maid. She was the last fluent speaker of Squamish. Not the last, but when I was growing up, they'd say there's only 12 fluent speakers left, and one of them was my grandma. She was a maid, raising 11 children after her husband passed when he was in his 30s. She raised 11 kids essentially on her own. Of course, she had help from family, but, you know, one of the last things I saw her eat was a bologna sandwich. And that broke my heart to see, because I was like, after all, she gave so much she was my preschool teacher. She prayed for our entire community, and she gave, in her retirement, she gave so much to universities. And, you know, granted, like, a lot of people like bologna, so I don't want to, like, shame that food, but I was like, Grandma, you deserve, like, the most fulfilling, both spiritually, emotionally, and nutritionally, meal right now. And all those people who are completing their PhDs and things like that by talking to you, this should, like, how can they sleep at night? And I see matriarchs, you know, kind of limping because of hip problems. And I'm like, they're just too, they're very strong-minded and want to continue to work. But there's been this mindset where we must serve. And it's in me as well. I won't say that it's not there. And there's a strength in service. There's a reverence in service. There's a deep and great respect in service. But how come a person is in their 70s and 80s still that way and being taken advantage of by people who are just wanting to learn? So give these women, like, they've been fighting for everybody, like our communities, the territory, and justice. And oftentimes in the past, they were just considered like the secretary or the treasurer, but my grandma, for example, my other grandma was a secretary, and the administrator was a woman. So there was that, but they would tease her and say, "We know who's really in charge." And she said it was my grandma. And that's what everyone felt to be true. And that's because she put in all the heavy work. And so that's the experience women that I know, leaders that I know, highly respected women that I know, that's the way they've lived. And if they've been giving their entire life, why not change that dynamic and consider giving to her? Because she's been giving years before you've touched this earth and took your first breath. So that's just what's on my mind in regards to that.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, for sharing that about the stories of your grandmothers, and I honor that so much. And moving here and meeting matriarchs and those who are becoming matriarchs, it's such an honor to even hold space, because I'm still coming to understand what it means to be a matriarch, what it means to hold your community, what it means to support your community, and that giving that without that need to be to take something back, I think is so important. And I think that's just, we live in a society where everyone feels as though they genuinely can do it themselves. You feel as though everything's so automated. I don't need anyone for anything. I can make my own money. I can get my own job. I can live my own life, and I need nothing. And that is so anti to humans and to, when we're thinking about food, to the way that systems work, the way that we genuinely are dependent on each other, and we should be. It's not something we should fight. And so I loved that most of what you talked about was relationship, building relationship, and what that truly means. And I think you're right. I think that changes and that definition alters when you think about COVID and things like that. But what is it like? What are your true relationships? How were they formed? Is it based on a materialistic means? Is it based on the conversations that you share? Are you sharing knowledge? Do you expect something back? Are you just holding space? Is someone holding space for you? Because I think you have a lot of givers and you have a lot of takers. But the question is there some sort of reciprocity there? And I loved that. I just love the idea of relationships and how core that is to food, to people, to knowledge, to understanding, to humans. So I genuinely honor your voice, and thank you so much for sharing.
Can I say something real simple?
Yeah.
I'm sure that people listening and also on the panel can make amazing food. Feed, offer those foods to our communities, because I don't cook because I want to provide the food literally by putting it into the earth and remediating the earth, but I always wish I could cook better, because I'm like, I don't want you to eat a bologna sandwich.
Tiffany, Tiffany, I'll feed you. Yo, I'll feed you. I'm not even gonna lie. I'll totally feed you. I got you on WhatsApp. I'll hit you up. I'll feed you. You and your peoples. Yeah, man. I got you. No, but that's very true, and I think you're very right in what we give and what we have ability to give, and the fact that everyone can give something. And I think in this world, it sometimes feels as though, well, I don't have anything to give. I don't have money. I don't have a car. I can't drive you somewhere. But when you think about who you are as a person, you can cook. You can hold space simply if it's conversation. You can maybe just gift something that you made, whether that's and things that you make with the love, the spirit, the honor of wanting to gift and nourish someone, and whether that's like their hearts, their minds, or their stomachs. I think there's so much beauty in that and so much power in that. So thank you for sharing that. And yeah, man, I'll cook for you. Listen.
Yeah. No, I love a lot of what's being said. In my culture, my grandmother's always taught me growing up, because our cultural framework in Palestine is really deeply built on the idea of generosity and hospitality, not from an idyllic standpoint, because there's a deep cultural understanding that to give a gift is to open a relationship of gift giving over time and throughout history. So it's not about expectation so much as it is about, once somebody gives you a gift which nourishes you, there should be a natural upsurgence of wanting to return that gift back to them, knowing that one day it'll find you again, whether through them or the members of your community, right? Thank you so much.
Thank you to everybody.
We're incredibly grateful. I don't think we have, do we have time for questions?
We have no time.
No. Okay. Beautiful.
Well, these are conversations we all love to have. And so I think I definitely speak for myself, and I think the panelists and everyone else can speak for themselves. But if there are questions that come up, because these are huge topics to sit with and to process and figure out, well, how do these impact me and how do they run in my life? And so the way that I work is maybe a week from now I'll be, I actually do have a question. And I very much work within that realm. And so if you do have a question, please feel free to share it and to open it. And I would welcome you to message most of us, if not any of us and all of us.
Well, and I also encourage that continuation of a dialogue, whether it's within the framework of the Good Food Summit or with people in your life, with your families, with your communities, with your grassroots movements, right? And I think the really important part of grassroots movement is it's made of us. It's for us, by us, of us as well. So bringing forward those questions from a place of curiosity is that we can only make it there together. There's no way we're going to do this alone.
Not at all.
And it's relationships, right? And relationships take time, and sometimes they're a little bit uncomfortable, and sometimes they're a little messy, and sometimes they're not.
And sometimes they're amazing.
So without asking those questions, we can't gain that intimacy and that insight into what's truly here for us and what's truly felt and needed by our communities to move forward. And the entire intention of this entire segment of the project was to really bring back the human aspect, the heart aspect of all of this, because the only true motivation that can move us forward through the difficulty and the stickiness of a lot of the things we see ourselves in is if we're coming from that place of feeling the power and the value of what it means to be in connection and in relationships that nourish us and honor each other as well. And remembering that in that reciprocal relationship, we're not just talking about the, excuse my lack of a better word, but like the woo-woo of it, which is like the love and the joy and all of these different sorts of things, but also the more challenging aspects around difficult communication and conflict resolution and what it means to be a warrior spirit amongst a world that is asking for it at this time.
It's not about the fluff. It's about working past those uncomfortable moments, for sure.
And enjoying a bit of fluff every now and then.
Yeah, you know, I'll be fluffing people. I'll also hit you where it hurts.
So thank you very, very much, everyone, for coming. And we just want to invite you as well. We know it's been a very long night or day, so to speak, of some really big topics. But come back tomorrow at 9 a.m.?
9 a.m.
9 a.m.
For the local
There's going to be another
economy
session. And before we take off, I just want to tune in real quick with our panelists. Is there anything else that you guys would like to say before we let each other go for the night?
I love you guys.
Just want to say thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna.
So we would we are grateful. Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you, Hannah. And there are a lot of things that need to be processed. But I just like the right away, I think I'm gonna cook for your family. I'm gonna cook for the community. I'm gonna make some fufu, and I'm gonna get in touch with you because, yeah, you just like showed me a different aspect of the food system that I never thought about it. And it's just like I'm just processing. There is so many things, but I got the message from you and your community, and yeah, I'm really grateful and I'm humble. So thank you. And in my language, Yoruba language, we say Ache. So it's trying like to pass on to you the capacity to bring change and make like things moving forward. So Ache to you all guys. Thank you.
You gonna say something,
Assalamualaikum.
Jess?
Thank you everyone for being here. And we had a great time.
Assalamu alaikum. Good night, everybody.